Anyways, I'm excited to share with you a little bit of the research that I've been doing towards my master's thesis. And of course, oil development is certainly a hot topic in the public sphere around issues of climate change, pipelines, landscape change, all that kind of thing. And so it kind of ties in nicely with just conversations that are going on within the public sphere right now. But before I get too heavy into oil and birds, I thought I'd just warm you up by setting the scene in terms of some pretty pictures. I have a supervisor who always says, you should include lots of pretty pictures for people. And so I just wanted to give you a picture of what it's like to be out there on some native prairie, or prairie in general, in case you've forgotten or in case you've never been out there, or just refresh your memory. So I actually grew up in the heart of the Canadian Shield in northwestern Ontario. Think rocks and trees and lakes. And I love that country, but I've been here in Saskatchewan for almost 20 years now and have really started to fall in love with the prairies, particularly as I spend more time on them and do more stuff on them. And it has a really, I think, understated beauty. And one of my favorite places to be is sunrise on a piece of really nice grass when the sun is coming up. It's a beautiful morning. The birds are singing, and so I'm just giving you some pictures here of what it's like to be out there at sunrise, because we survey birds really early in the morning. And if you've ever spent time in the southeast of the province over the last 5 or 6 years, it is really wet out there. And most mornings look like this, super foggy, but it's kind of cool too. For the plant people, here's a few prairie wildflowers and forbs and such, and just some really beautiful plants. Again, it's really neat when you're walking along and you come across like a lady slipper or something like that. Really beautiful plants out there. Besides birds, there's other wildlife hanging around on grassland ecosystems, and so we have amphibians and reptiles. There's a garter snake over there on the left. And then down here, it might be hard to see, but this was a Coyote Den. There's a couple pups here. And we actually had a point count that just so happened to be about 20 meters away from this den. And it was really hard not to be distracted when you're counting birds by these 5 or 6 little pups that all came up and were just watching what we were doing. It was really cool. And then, of course, there's the birds. And most birds in a grassland ecosystem make their nest directly on the ground. So in kind of an open cup, as you see on the left, or this is a killdeer nest right here. They just lay right on a bed of gravel. This is actually an old well pad that I came across. This is a chestnut-colored longspur nest. This is a clay-colored sparrow nest. Beautiful blue eggs, very, very tiny eggs. This guy actually builds its nest a little bit off the ground, usually in some low-lying shrubs. And you can notice that this egg and this egg look different than the rest of those eggs. Any idea what species of egg that came from? Cowbird, brown-headed cowbird. So brown-headed cowbirds are really unique. They're a brood parasite, which means they don't establish their own breeding territories and build their own nests. But they do, the female of the brown-headed cowbird sits and watches for other species around it, looking to be building their nests and laying their eggs, and then when that mom flies off, she comes along, boots one of their eggs out, and puts her own egg in there, and then the idea is that that other species will raise the chick for it. And so a really unique relationship there. And then we have young birds. So on this side, this is a young horned lark, a fledgling. This cute guy is a little killdeer. Probably just a few hours old, that was running around. And then this ugly one, this is typically what a young nestling songbird looks like. Really only the face that a mother could love. Like, they are just ugly when they are first born, until they get their feathers and start looking more like this. I really enjoy having my family come out too. I have 2 girls, Ava and Emma, and I love having them come out during the summer when I'm doing field work and just get them to have a sense of what the prairies are like. You know, when you drive along the number 1, you just see a bunch of agricultural cropland, and it's easy for us to forget that's not what the prairies really are. Birds and all of these other really cool species associated with them, and so it's fun to have them come out and spend a day with me. And we always happen to cross a few nests, and so this is a Longspur nest that they came across, and we're able to check it out. So let's get into a bit more of the nitty-gritty here. So as a whole, we know that grassland birds are declining. They're in trouble. The group of grassland birds has seen about a 40% decline since the 1970s. And that's this green line here that you can see the trend happening. Within that group, some species have declined by as much as 68 to 91% in that time frame. Now you can see that this trend looks like it's leveled off a little bit in the last 10 years, which is good news. But that's for the group as a whole. There are still some species that are grassland birds that are still in steep decline, even throughout that last 10 years. And many of these that are still continuing to decline are native grass specialists, which means that these are birds that really focus in and depend on native grass and tend to select breeding territories primarily in native grass pastures and tend to avoid tame grass pastures. And a couple of those species would be Sprague's pipit and Chestnut-Colored Longspur. So what the big question is, well, what's driving these declining populations? And so habitat loss is going to be a primary factor. Just the fact that we have less than 20% of our native grass prairies remaining in Saskatchewan is going to mean that it's going to have impacted bird populations. But think about when most of that native prairie was lost. That conversion happened 70, 80 years ago, towards the beginning of the 20th century. And so one of the questions that we have is, what is driving these more recent declines that we're seeing? We're still seeing bird populations decline. Why? What's behind that? Are there other factors other than just habitat loss? And so one thought is that possibly oil development that's occurring on grassland ecosystems is further contributing to the loss and degradation of grassland habitat. So the footprint of oil development on the landscape can take a few different forms. We have the physical well structures, and the well pads that they're situated on takes up a footprint of land. Then there's larger footprints associated with things like oil batteries. And then there's all of these linear features like power lines, pipelines, and roads and trails that further fragment the remaining patches of grass habitat into smaller and smaller pieces, and so might possibly be degrading that habitat or just making it so small that it's hard for animals to find a patch big enough for them to be in. Oil development is a big thing in Saskatchewan right now on the prairies, particularly in the southeastern part of the province. And so this oil boom, particular one, is happening over what's called the Bakken Formation. And you can see it goes across southern Saskatchewan, extends down into Montana and North Dakota. And so in Saskatchewan, we actually have about 25% of that oil formation. Heavy drilling really began in that area around 2006, and this is when a couple of new technologies really began to be used. Horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing that allowed access to that particular formation and the oil that was there. And so in 2013, we saw almost 3,000 new wells drilled in Saskatchewan. The majority of those would have been put in the southeast. And since 2006, we've seen 18,000 wells completed in this province. Again, the majority of those going in the southeast. And so this just goes to show that this is a booming thing happening in Saskatchewan. It will likely continue for a while. It's important to know what kind of effect it's having on the landscape and on the wildlife, specifically birds in my case. So with that background in mind and those issues giving context, my overall research question is, what effect might oil development be having, if any, on grassland songbird populations? So this is a pretty broad question, and I need to break that down into more manageable, testable questions. So first of all, what effect does proximity to oil wells have on bird abundance? So is there a difference in bird abundance between areas close to wells and farther away from wells? Secondly, what effect does well density have on bird abundance? So again, Is there a difference in abundance between areas with little or no wells and areas with lots and lots of wells? And then thirdly, what effect does overall disturbance have on bird abundance? So if we were to add up all of those disturbances, including roads and trails and things like that, and look at highly disturbed areas and little or no disturbed areas, is there a difference in bird abundance there? For the rest of this talk, I'm just going to focus on these first two questions having to do with distance to well and well density. Another really interesting question is whether the effect of possible negative effects of oil development might be compounded even more by poor quality habitat. And so poor quality habitat could be represented by tame grass pastures. So if you're unfamiliar with prairie and grass, you might just think that grass is grass. But that's not the way that birds look at it, or other animals for that matter. So on this side, this is a picture showing a typical native grass pasture. And so it typically has a wide diversity, a wide different number of species of grass and forbs. And it creates a very heterogeneous structure. So lots of different heights and dense areas and bare areas and things like that. Lots of different structure for birds to choose from. On this side, this represents a typical non-native or tame pasture. I'll just refer to them as tame from now on. And so these are pastures that typically have been reseeded with non-native grasses, usually Asian grasses like crested wheat or smooth brome. And it creates a fairly monocultural effect and fairly structurally homogeneous as well. And so it looks quite a bit different than native grass. And birds respond to it differently often. So as I said, my study area is in the southeast of the province. So here's Regina. This is where I did all of my surveying, and so it's down around that Weyburn, Estevan, Carlisle area, almost all the way over to the Manitoba border and almost all the way south to the US border. And as I said, I chose this area because it has a wide gradient of oil development, areas with no oil development, all the way to areas with very heavy oil development, and so I could compare across that gradient. It also has a range of native and tame pastures on both public and private land, and so I surveyed across that whole gradient as well. So in order to collect my data, it involved doing lots and lots of surveys. And so of course, I had my avian surveys, and so what I did for this were I used 5-minute point counts with a 100-meter radius. So a point count is simply where an observer goes out with a clipboard and a piece of paper, and they record all the birds that they see and hear around them within a 100-meter radius. The species, whether they're male or female, if they can figure that out, and that kind of thing. And I located, so if there was a focal well, and I would locate one random point count closer to a well within a 100-meter buffer, and then a second random point count farther away from that well within a 400-meter buffer. And then I had 4 observers visit the site 4 different times so that I could have multiple visits with multiple observers. And I'll talk a little bit about why I did that in a bit. Along with all these avian surveys, we also did veg surveys associated with every single point count to get an idea of what the average vegetation structure was around those point counts. And so we measured height and litter depth and that kind of stuff, density, grass type, so percent native species versus percent tame species and things like that. So here is an example of one of my sample areas. So this large circle encompasses this whole sample area. And this is a 908-meter radius circle, which represents 1 square mile. And so you can think a section. It's roughly a section. And so I'm interested in what's happening within this section and how birds are responding to what's going on within this section. So at the center, this is the focal well for this sample area. And this red dot represents my near point count within this 100-meter buffer, so it could be randomly located anywhere within here. This yellow dot represents my farther away point count from this well within this 400-meter buffer. Again, this could be located randomly anywhere in here. So that's how I get my different distances to wells. Then I can also count up all of the wells in here to calculate density. You can see all these various wells, add them up. That's density for this sample area. And then I can also quantify all this other disturbance, the roads and the trails, and it looks like an oil battery up here, and determine how much space that disturbance is taking up, quantify that to get a sense of overall disturbance for this sample area. As was mentioned, I've had two field seasons already, so I've done my field work, and they happened in 2013 and 2014. And so surveys were always conducted during the breeding season, which for these birds is generally about mid-May to very early July. As I said, 4 trained observers each year went out and surveyed, and we were able to visit a total of 243 sample sites. And you can see the breakdown between how many were tame and how many were native. Overall, this resulted in almost 2,000 avian point counts and almost 2,000 vegetation surveys. So a lot of data to go through. So these are 11 species that I've collected enough data on to analyze. And for this talk, I'm going to focus on these 8. And so I'll just introduce you to them briefly. So starting up here, first you'll notice that each of them has a 4-letter code, and this corresponds to their name, usually the first 2 letters of each, if it's a double name. So Baird Sparrow, B-A-I-S, well, the sparrows are difficult. Anyways, just know 4-letter codes associated with each bird. You'll see these codes throughout the presentation, but I'll also refer to the birds by their common names. So Baird Sparrow, has what I think is a very beautiful song. Kind of trails off into a tinkly trill or like a bouncing ball. Bobolink, really showy kind of bird. Those males love to sing, pop out and sing and make themselves known. Really nice white on the back and yellow on the back of the head. Beautiful bird. This is the brown-headed cowbird that I was talking about. That's a brood parasite. This is probably my favorite grassland bird, Chestnut-Colored Longspur. I think they're just a beautiful bird with that. The males have that deep black breast and that chestnut patch on the back. And they do just a really cool flight display, these males. They pop up, and when they do their song, their flight display, they kind of throw their head and their wings back and flutter down doing their song. It's really cool. This is the Grasshopper Sparrow, really tiny sparrow, very cryptic. Its song is very thin, hard to hear sometimes. This is the horned lark, usually associated with bare ground. You can even find it in stubble fields sometimes. Sprague's pipit. This guy, this species creates a really neat nest. So it's on the ground, but it's a dome. It's not an open cup. It's a really enclosed dome with just a little opening in it. And really hard to find if you're doing nest searches. And then we have the Vesper sparrow, which is a bit of a larger sparrow, likes to perch and sing and make itself known usually. So of these species, these 3, the Baird sparrow, the Longspur, and pipit, are all known as what we would call native grass specialists. So birds that are associating primarily with native grass and tending to avoid tame grass fields. Bobolink tends to be, at least in this area, associated often with tame fields. Not because it's necessarily selecting for tame grass, but because it likes that really lush, dense vegetation. My one supervisor calls it rank grass, so if you can think of what rank grass is. So if you were to come across a native field that's gone on graze for a few years, is really tall, they'll pack in there too. But they just really are looking for that kind of really thick, tall vegetation, and usually with a selection of foraging as well. Then these 4 species we'll call more generalist species. They don't really tend to differentiate between native or tame grass usually. And these 4 species, Baird sparrow, bobolinks, chestnut-colored longspurs, and Sprague's pipit, are all listed as species at risk in Canada. All right, so this is a bar graph just showing kind of what were the most prevalent birds across the study area in my sample years. And so on the y-axis we have the percent of sample sites where at least one individual of that species occurred and on the x-axis we have all of the species. And so you can see that some species, like Savannah Sparrow, Brown-headed Cowbird, and Western Meadowlark, are occurred pretty much at 100% of my sites. They're just ubiquitous across the south of the province. And then notice these 4 species that I pointed out that were species at risk, and also these 3 are native grass specialists. They're on the lower occurring end across the study area. And so their populations are already low, and likely if there are negative effects of oil development, it just may put even further pressure on them, particularly if that oil development is occurring on native grass for these native grass specialists. All right, before I get into showing you some results, I don't want to bore you with math, but I'll just give you a brief description about what I'm doing to come up with these results. So I'm using statistical models. And so as an ecologist or as a biologist, I'm trying to understand what's actually occurring in a real-world system, in a natural ecosystem, in this case, grasslands and birds. And we can only measure a piece of that very complex system. So we go out and we take some measurements of different variables, but it's only a piece of that complex system. And so statistical models allow us to look at those variables and see how they're related and test whether those variables are important and whether those relationships are important, and try and reflect what's actually occurring in the real world. So it's a simplified model of hopefully of what's occurring in the real world. And so as I said, we go out there and we measure a bunch of variables. So we count birds, we measure various grass variables or vegetation variables, measure distance to wells, well density, all of these things. And then my question is, well, how are these related? Or even are they related? And are those relationships important? And more importantly, how are these variables related to bird abundance? Are they having any effect on bird abundance? And which variables are the most important in explaining that bird abundance? And so this is what modeling is helping me to do. So first of all, in my models, as I put these together, I have to be able to account for what we call imperfect detection. So that means that when we go out there and survey birds, we're not actually counting all the birds that are really there. A bird has to make itself known. So you're out there, you're counting birds, you're only recording the ones that you actually see and hear. That's never all the birds that were actually there. So a bird has to sing or pop out of the grass or something to make itself known. And by modeling different variables that are associated with detection, this is why I do repeat visits with different observers to really get at what was trying to estimate what the true abundance was. And so I can estimate detection probability with all of these things to get a better understanding of what the true abundance of each species was there. After I am able to account for detection probability, I then also have to be able to account for vegetation and how it's influencing bird abundance. So I measure all of these various vegetation parameters. And vegetation is important because birds are really cueing in on very specific local structure of vegetation. So whether it's vegetation height or density or litter depth or something like that, this is how they're selecting their local breeding territories. And so I have to be able to account for that before I look at how wells or other oil development stuff is influencing bird abundance. So once I've accounted for detection probability and accounted for what vegetation is doing to bird abundance, then I can, on top of that, look at oil variables, so distance to wells, well density, and then I can be able to say, well, so knowing what vegetation is doing and what detection is doing to abundance, do these oil variables explain even more of the variation in abundance after accounting for all this stuff? And if that's the case, then I can have a pretty good sense that, okay, oil is playing an important role in affecting bird abundance. All right, so I built these models, test them against each other, and what I'm showing you here is right now what I understand to be the top model for each of these species. And so you can see that for all species except Savannah sparrow and Vesper sparrow, that oil variables are playing an important role. Okay? For savanna sparrow and vesper sparrow, it seems to be that vegetation is playing the most important role. However, for vesper sparrows, the veg and oil model was very, very, very close to this top model, so there's really no difference there. So I would say that 10 out of 11 species, oil is playing an important role in explaining some of the variation in their abundance. On this side, this is just giving you an indication of what the various oil variables are that are important for each of these species. And I just want to explain what I mean by activity. So density and distance to well are pretty self-explanatory. Activity, what I mean by that, so there's three categories: active wells, abandoned wells, and no wells. No wells is obvious. Active wells, I don't mean that the pump jack was necessarily doing this. What I do mean is that that well is actively producing. Those pump jacks shut on and off. It has nothing to do with whether that well is producing. But a producing well, it's being visited on a daily basis by operators and things like that. So it's actively producing oil. An abandoned well is no longer producing oil. So there may still be a physical structure there. The pump jack might still be there. Or there might just be a capped well, but no longer producing oil, likely not being visited by an operator or anything like that. All right. Well, let's get into some of these results. And I want to start with these native grass specialists, these three species: Barred sparrow, Chestnut-Colored, Longspur, and Sprague's pipit. So I just want to show you these graphs to just demonstrate that, yes, these birds have quite a bit higher abundance in native fields versus tame fields. So you can see that abundance is on the y-axis. So for all the plots that you see, this is how they're going to be set up. Abundance is going to be on the y-axis, and the various oil variables will be on the y-axis. Anyways, this is not surprising and fairly self-explanatory. Oh, I should also just, again, I don't want to get too math heavy for you, but just explain a little bit about error bars and things like that. So on these bar graphs, these error bars are representing standard error. And it just means, so this is the mean abundance, but this is the variation around that mean. And so it just demonstrates how much variation is in the data. So really tall error bars means lots of variation. Very skinny error bars means very little variation.
Jason?
Yes?
What are the units on abundance?
These are numbers of individuals. Given at any given area across the sample area, across the study area, this is the mean number of individuals that you would find. Okay, or the expected mean number of individuals. So I'm showing you model predicted abundances. Okay, does that make sense? Okay.
So mean number per point count.
Mean number per point count, thanks, Steve. Okay, so what I want you to notice here is that we have well activity on the y-axis. Again, our three categories: active, abandoned, and none. Barred sparrow is definitely showing a trend where they have higher abundance in areas where there are no wells, particularly compared to areas with active wells. Sprague's pipit and Longspurs seem to be showing a similar trend, although notice the variation in those error bars. There may not be a strong relationship there, but the trend does seem to be there. What I'm showing you here is the relationship of abundance to well distance for both Barred sparrow and Longspurs. And really, nothing's going on here. And I wanted to show you this because I looked at all of the relationships between abundance for each species and all the oil variables. And I'm not going to keep showing you all of the no effect stuff, but I just wanted to show you that I did do this stuff and looked at whether there was an effect or not an effect. And again, these are 85% confidence intervals for those of you that are into the math. And it just, again, explains the variation around this mean.
So can I ask a question? I think I understand it.
Yes.
You're saying it really doesn't matter how far they are from the well. That has no effect?
No, there's no effect. You don't see any kind of trend. So they're not increasing in abundance or decreasing in abundance. And really, within these confidence intervals, this line could do anything within there. Like it could be positive, it could be negative, so that's why confidence intervals are important. So what you're seeing here is Baird sparrow abundance and its relationship to well density between native grass pastures and tame grass pastures. So there may be a slight effect here where Baird sparrow abundance decreases with more wells in tame grass, although those confidence intervals suggest maybe no effect. But in tame grass pastures, that effect gets stronger. And so abundance is decreasing in tame grass pastures with more wells. And this suggests to me that tame grass is having an additional effect on this negative effect of well density. So it may be representing poor quality habitat for this species. Here, this is Sprague's pipit and its abundance in relationship to also well density. And so you can see here that abundance increases to about 7 or 8 wells and then starts to decrease. So there's a threshold here at which more wells becomes a negative effect for abundance. And again, the difference between active wells and abandoned wells. So reduced abundance in areas where there's active wells and a little bit higher abundance in areas where there are abandoned wells.
One more question, is this within the 908 square meters, like is this within?
Yes, so this well density represents how many wells are within a section. Here we have an interesting effect with longspurs, and I'm not really sure exactly what's going on here. So not much of an effect. So again, abundance and its relationship to well density. Not much effect in tame grass pastures on abundance, but in native grass pastures it seems to be increasing in abundance as there are more wells within that section. And so not really sure what's going on there. This is an interesting relationship. But I also just want you to notice that there's a difference again between native grass and tame grass for this species, suggesting that possibly native or tame grass is poor habitat, particularly in areas where there are lots of wells for this species. So moving on to grasshopper sparrow. Again, so here's abundance on the y-axis, well activity on the x-axis. This is a bird that has higher abundance in abandoned and no well areas and reduced abundance in active well areas. So it seems to be avoiding those active wells. Also, there is an interesting relationship between abundance and distance to well between abandoned and active well areas. So maybe a slight effect in abandoned well areas where it has slightly reduced abundance closer to wells. But when they are an active well, it definitely seems to be showing that this species has lower abundance the closer you get to a well. And then for grasshopper sparrows, this is abundance in its relationship to well density. So again, another threshold here, around 14 wells per section, where after that its abundance starts to decline. And also in abandoned wells, same kind of relationship, but overall the abundance seems to be higher in areas with abandoned wells compared to areas with active wells. Okay, this is the bobbling, and again I'm just showing you this relationship with habitat to show you that yes, we do find it more in tame fields compared to native fields, but again it's not necessarily selecting for tame grass specifically, just for that structure and that density. This species does not have seem to have any effect really between well activity and abundance. I mean there's a slightly higher mean for abundance in areas with no wells, but those error bars suggest that there's not much going on there. However, for this species, there is an effect between abundance and well density. And so Interestingly for this species, that it has quite a bit reduced abundance in high well areas in tame grass fields, and similar relationship where abundance is decreasing with more wells in tame grass, but not quite as much as in native grass pastures. So again, suggesting that this bird is looking for specific habitat, and that habitat, preferred habitat, maybe when it finds it, might be mitigating some of those negative effects of well density. Brown-headed cowbirds, they do not, at least in my 2 years, couldn't show any difference or any preference for native or tame, not surprising. But interestingly, when I look at its abundance in comparison with well activity, there is no effect in tame grass pastures, but it definitely has an effect where it is found at higher abundance in areas with active wells compared to areas with no wells. So again, even for this species that doesn't necessarily select between native and tame, it might be suggesting that there's something going on there with the quality of habitat in native grass pastures that it seems to be attracted to active well areas within these native grass pastures. This is brown-headed cowbirds and its abundance in response to well density. No real effect happening here in native grass pastures. Possibly a slight negative effect in tame grass pastures where the more wells, the more reduced its abundance is. Then for Vesper sparrows and horned larks, this is their abundance associated with well activity. There seems to be maybe a slight trend for both of these species where they have slightly higher abundance in areas of active wells compared to areas with no wells. But again, a lot of variation in those error bars. However, horned larks do have a bit of a threshold when it comes to well density and abundance, so increasing abundance up to about 14 wells per section, and then has a negative effect on abundance after that. Vesper sparrows, on the other hand, seem to have a bit of a positive relationship with well density, so their abundance seems to increase with more wells. And particularly in native grass pastures. So again, maybe there's something about the quality of native grass that's allowing them to respond more positively to the number of oil wells in native grass pastures. All right, so I just showed you quite a bit of data, and so let me just summarize it here quickly for you. So what we saw was several species are definitely showing some negative effects of oil development on their abundance. And so particularly, Baird sparrow and grasshopper sparrows have reduced abundance in areas with oil wells. So they seem to be avoiding areas where there are wells. Possibly this is also true for longspurs and pipits, although that relationship was somewhat weaker. Grasshopper sparrows also have reduced abundance closer to wells. So the closer you get to a well, the less number of those birds you'll find. And then Baird sparrows and bobolinks have reduced abundance in areas with higher well density. So the more wells, the fewer individuals you'll find. And for grasshopper sparrows, horned lark, and pipits, while they did have an increasing relationship with as well density increased, that eventually peaked at a threshold and then declined. So there was a threshold where once you got more wells than that, it started to decrease their abundance. We saw a trend where often active wells further reduce abundance over abandoned wells. And so this was true for Sprague's pipit, grasshopper sparrows, and bobolinks. And so many of these species are native grass specialists that are being negatively affected and or species at risk. On the other hand, some species do have limited, what I would call limited positive associations with oil wells and abundance. So brown-headed cowbirds had higher abundance in areas with active wells, but this was only true in native grass pastures. And then possibly a similar relationship for horned larks and Vesper sparrows, where they might have higher abundance in areas of active wells. There was no effect, no positive effect of distance to well on abundance for any species. And both Longspurs and Vesper sparrows did have higher abundance in areas with higher well densities, but for both of these species, this was only true in native grass pastures. So it does seem that tame grass is often associated with either stronger negative effects or mitigating some of the negative effects for a number of these species. And this is true even for species that have positive associations with oil wells. And so I would suggest that tame grass seems to represent poorer quality habitat in the presence of oil development for some of these species. So I kind of just want to give you a sense of what the big picture is here. So species that are most negatively affected by oil development are usually the ones that depend primarily on native grass, or those that already have stressed populations, such as species at risk. And I want to also just make it clear that it's not just my data that's saying this. There have been other studies over the last 4 or 5 years, some that have come out of the lab I'm associated with, and some from other universities or other associations across Canada, across the prairies, that have looked at the response of grassland songbirds to oil development. And it seems to be suggesting, the evidence seems to be showing that it is these, mostly these native grass specialists that tend to be negatively influenced by the presence of this kind of resource development on their habitat. And so this is an indication that oil development is placing increasing pressures on grassland habitat and likely reducing the health of grassland ecosystems. And because of that, oil development is likely contributing to the reduction of grassland bird populations and their diversity. So why should you care about this? Why care if we are seeing some species of birds disappear that you probably maybe you never even knew about them before? Well, birds, and in particular native grass specialist birds, are indicator species of the health of the ecosystem. And so these native grass specialists, in the past, they've developed very specific advantages associated with native grass pastures. And so the health of their population, they're going to be more sensitive to changes in that ecosystem. And so as we see their populations change, and in this case decline, it's a reflection of the health of that ecosystem. And so I think that it's suggesting that grassland ecosystems are in trouble. And again, this evidence, so the evidence that I've been showing here tonight and some of the other studies that have been published recently seem to be suggesting that oil development is contributing to the declining of health of grassland ecosystems if we look at birds as an indicator of that. All right, I'll wrap it up here. So what are the take-home messages from this? What are the things I want you to remember? Well, first of all, oil development is negatively affecting some grassland songbirds species. I think it was pretty clear that for Baird sparrow, grasshopper sparrows, and bobolinks, these are 3 species that are definitely showing negative associations in their abundance with oil development. And these kind of variables that negatively influence these birds include things like avoiding areas with wells, avoiding areas near wells, and avoiding areas of higher well density, or at least reduced abundance in association with these things. Secondly, it's native grass specialists and species at risk that seem to be particularly vulnerable to negative effects of oil development. So species that their populations are already low and under pressure. Thirdly, some species do have positive relationships with oil development. It's not a black and white picture. It's a bit of a complex issue, and so it would be wrong to say it's all bad or it's all good. It's complex, and so we have to look at it species by species and individual responses. And then fourthly, with respect to the question of does poor quality habitat possibly further compound negative effects of oil development, I would suggest that I think yes it does, at least for some species. I think that was evident in some of that data. And this is true even for species that tend to have positive associations with oil wells. With that, I'd be happy to take any other questions that you might have.
I understand that oil